Shabbat Shalom. Jacob has fled his home. He has cheated his brother Esau. He is afraid of, well, his own murder. And so he heads off under his parents' instruction to go find a bride. But before he can get very far in this week's Torah portion of Vayeitzei, it's nightfall. And this man of the tents, this man who had grown up quite innocent in many ways and quite pampered in others, is now forced to sleep with nothing but a rock for a pillow. During the night, he dreams of a great ladder stretching between the earth and the heavens, and there are angels going up the ladder and angels coming down. Symbolizing, he realizes that although he is leaving this land of Eretz Israel, the land of promise to Abraham, that there are angels still coming to accompany him as he continues his journey. And God is making a promise to him that he will protect Jacob no matter where he goes and will eventually bring him back. Jacob wakes up. He is moved by this amazing spiritual experience, and he makes a promise to God. He says, God, if you do what you have promised, a little presumptuous, as if God was going to not do it, but if you do, I will give you 10% of everything I make. 10%. Not a bad return on investment, right? 10% return, you would probably be very grateful for your broker if he was able to give you a 10% return. God is going to invest in Jacob and get 10% back. But 10% of what? What exactly is the bargain that is being struck here? Notice from Jacob's point of view, God mentioned no such bargain. Well, our commentators, as usual, are divided on the topic. And they present at least three different alternatives. The first is the most straightforward, the most obvious, the most peshat, if you will, the simplest to read from the text, which is Jacob is saying, you know what, God? You take care of me, and I will give back to you 1/10 of what I have. Since he is going to become a shepherd, that would mean out of every 10 sheep that walk in front of him, the 10th sheep would get the knife and become a sacrifice to God. Not bad, right? God's making out pretty good. He gets 1 out of every 10 sheep offered up as a sacrifice. Any problems with this? Really, what does God need sheep for? Honestly, is God building a flock? Does God have parties every so often and he needs more mutton to be able to offer to people? What would God do with more sheep? Now, not to disparage the importance and spirituality of the sacrifices for our ancestors, that would not necessarily be what God was looking for on an ROI, the return of investment that he was making in Jacob. Gee, thank you for thinking of me, Jacob, and giving me more sheep. Just what I needed, because, it's not like I'm God and could make as many sheep as I wanted. Maybe that is a slightly limited understanding. Another commentator has a much more creative and much more mathematically complicated interpretation of what 10% is going to mean. Because after all, we know that the most important thing that Jacob will be gaining during this week's Torah portion is not sheep and goats, although he gets plenty of those, but children. Jacob begins to build an enormous family. So, says this commentator, if we look at his family, and we say the firstborn of each of the 4 wives are already set aside as the firstborn of any woman is, then that leaves how many left? 12 minus 4 people. 8. So if we were to count them in order, going from Simeon, remember not counting Reuben because he was the firstborn, going from Simeon through Benjamin, who was coming along, if not having been birthed just yet. If we were to count from Simeon to Benjamin, we would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Which would mean we would have to go back to the beginning and count Simeon, and then, who's number 3 in the line? You can cheat and look at the thing above me. Levi. And wouldn't you know it, guess who gets dedicated as a tribe to God's service? Thank you, that wasn't a trick question. You gotta work with me, people. So, says the commentator, boom, there is Jacob making good on his vow. The 10th are the 10% with this unusual math of Jacob's children. And that 10th is the tribe of Levi. They go off and become the permanent family serving God, both as Kohanim, which is a subgroup of the Levites, and the rest of the Levites as well. Okay, but was God looking for having special priests when he was making a promise to Jacob? Was God looking and asking about having people who would be able to sing so beautifully and be able to offer the sacrifices so punctiliously? Didn't really seem to be at the top of God's list. And certainly from the other texts that we receive from God, it doesn't seem to dominate the theme. So along comes commentator number 3. And he says, yes, sacrifices were important, and certainly they had the capacity to move a person in their understanding of their relationship to God, and they were more for the giver than for God. And certainly having the Levites, the Kohanim, to provide a structure and always a part of our community that could lead and teach, this was an important institution to make sure that all of our traditions and our wisdom would not be lost. But where do we know that God actually tells us about giving 10% more generically? Where do we see 10% coming as a regular activity within the Jewish communal world long after Jacob? Tzedakah, giving to others. And he interprets that what Jacob was saying to God was not, I will give 10% back to you, but I will give back 10% for you, meaning on your behalf, in your name, in your spirit, I will be moved to help others around me with part of the blessing that you give me. I'm not going to take everything you give me, God, and say, wow, God must really like me. Now I can roll around in a giant bed of gold or sheepskins, and this is all mine because clearly God has blessed me. But instead, Jacob is saying to God, you know what, God? For whatever you give me, I will give your name more praise in this world by telling people as I help them that I do so because God has inspired me to help you. And people will understand that the God who created the world did not walk away and leave them in despair and squalor, but the God who created the world wants us to be able to help each other. And that to truly serve God is to give from what we have been blessed with to those who need more blessing. And that is a gift that God is giving to those who have that capacity. There was a mocker, a scoffer among the Romans who came to one of the rabbis during the Roman time of occupation, and they said to them, do you not realize that you are thwarting your God's will? He said, if my emperor put someone in the doghouse, said this person was no good and no one should help them, nobody in the empire would go and help that person because they would be afraid of what the emperor would do to them. And yet you believe that you have this omnipotent one God over all of creation, and when you see somebody suffering in poverty or other strife, you go and help them? Don't you think your God's going to be angry at you for helping them? After all, isn't God the one that made them suffer? To which the rabbi said, well, actually, it's you Romans making us suffer. He actually kept his tongue back a little bit from that, but you can read between the lines. But Judaism has always recognized that suffering does not come because God has willed it upon each and every victim, but suffering usually comes because of other conditions, either beyond the victim's control or deliberately in the control of someone else who is causing their life to be worse. And Rabbi Akiva said, it is our blessing that God has given us the opportunity to be a partner with God, to be able to help them. For if God had not allowed us the chance, the moment to be able to step in and say, I will help you, then how would we prove that we have truly understood what God has taught us? How would we ever have the experience of knowing what it is to help another person in dire straits? How would we be able to truly grow from that moment? That is a return on investment. For God to take this young man and say to him, I know that things look tough for you right now. You've only got a rock for a pillow after all. But things will get better. And to have moved that person so much, not only by having the confidence that their life will eventually become better, it takes 20-some years, by the way, but it does get there, but to move them to such an extent that not only will they have faith and strength to persevere, but they will have the humility and the humanity to take that experience and share it with someone else in a way that will bless them too. That was what God was trying to achieve by touching Jacob at this moment, so that Jacob would set a precedent and an example for his children, and they would become a nation which would set an example for the generations that came and for all others as well. I have to say, after 3,000 years, I think God made a pretty smart investment. Shabbat Shalom.